Hello there. My name is Daniel Ware, and I'm the Genealogy Librarian here at the Kentucky Historical Society. And welcome to another one of my Saturday genealogy programs that I try to put on usually the second Saturday of each month. I believe February through October, just because after that point we start getting into all the holidays and all that kind of stuff, so it gets a little harder for people to have time for some of this kind of stuff. So anyways, let me get some of this stuff kind of up and ready to go for you all. We started up a new intro video, so I was trying to kind of get that worked in and get all the different camera screens to do what they need to do. Anyways, so today we are going to talk about, well, the topic is mapping your roots. I'm basically going to talk about, kind of give some examples of some different types of maps you may come across when you're doing your family research. And just some of them are going to be not necessarily ones that you'll come across all the time, and that may not necessarily be, exactly super important to your research, but, you may come across them and, they may be of use of some sort, and so it's good to know. And I'm always interested, people that know me know that I get really into kind of strange and random things when it comes to history, whether that's, strange history books that were written that, are a very specific topic that aren't going to be broadly written about, and things like that. And I've always thought maps were interesting. And so I wanted to first off also talk about maps just because they can be helpful with genealogy and family research, but also just kind of going back to my past where, I would come across maps, or, there's a particular book that I'm going to reference for this presentation that I own. And I thought some of the maps back when I got the book years and years ago, I thought was really interesting. So I was going to kind of highlight a few of those, but also talk about, types of maps you might find here at the Kentucky Historical Society or at other institutions and things like that. So there will also be the more straightforward maps that show where people lived and show landmarks and things like that that would be more beneficial to your research. We'll talk about that as well. Let me fix the screen one more time. There we go. All right, so that way you can still see me in the corner, but see my actual presentation too. Anyways, let me see if I can fix this a little bit. I know my sound's going to be probably a bit off, because I know it's had issues with not being super loud, but then if I talk into the mic a certain way, it sounds a little too loud to me. So I'm trying to find that balance until we get some of the sound issues fixed. Anyway, so like I said before, this is mapping your roots. I'm just going to talk about different maps and try to give some general advice of how you could use them for your family research. And so the introduction, some of the main things I'm going to go over are going to be types of maps, how maps can help your research, where you can find these different types of maps, and then kind of show some pictures and give a brief description of maps that we have here at the Kentucky Historical Society. So some different types of maps could be there's basically, I know a lot of them that I look at and that I've used before are, there's just general, I like to call them general maps. They probably have a more official term. But then there's atlases, and these will show homesteads and where people lived and things like that. I really enjoy that. I've actually talked about one specific one that I'm going to talk about in a moment. I've actually talked about it quite a bit whenever I do bring up maps or atlases. just because I always thought that this one particular, and I'm sure there's several versions, other versions of this, other counties, but this is the one I've found here at KHS, and I always like to talk about it. But I'll talk about that in just a second. And there's also plat maps. There's excuse me, I'm getting tongue-tied. There's topographic maps. And then there's also the special interest maps, which those were kind of the ones I was alluding to at the start that I, found in a book that I own, and just always thought were interesting, just of what information they provide. So the maps or atlases showing homesteads. One example that we have here at KHS is an atlas of Henry and Shelby counties, Kentucky, and it's basically relating to the different districts and sections of Henry and Shelby counties in 1882. And it does have very valuable information. It'll show maps of different districts of the counties. It includes, as previously mentioned, the homesteads. It also has different charts that'll depict the number of acres, the occupation, the closest post office, the nativity of where that landowner was originally from, and then the date of when they originally settled, like in this example, in Henry or Shelby County. So they can be very useful in pinpointing when and where your ancestor may have lived, and you can gather information that could help with following migration. Here's a cover of it. Basically, it's just a very plain looking book. It's a pretty decent sized book, but and then here's kind of the examples of the charts I was talking about previously. So it'll list the landowner or the homeowner in their precincts, and then it'll, in the next column over, it'll have their acreage, and then, like I previously mentioned, the post office or the nearest post office, and then what their occupation is, and and all that kind of stuff. And you can, I know these pictures aren't going to be the best, because when I took them, I took them and putting them on a PowerPoint, it's kind of hard to really get to see them really, really well sometimes. But then basically you could look at something like this, if you happen to find, a atlas book of the county that your ancestor was in, and it may be for a different year. I'm not entirely sure how many of these they produced, as far as county and time period wise, but I just know this is one that I've seen a lot here at KHS, and that I look to a lot, or I like to look at it, and especially if I'm showcasing maps or atlases, I like to talk about this, just because I enjoy seeing these charts. Because if I did have an ancestor that lived in Newcastle in 1882, I could learn, oh, they were a farmer, oh, they were originally from Henry County or Shelby County or Oldham County. And, you can see, oh, they were in that particular homestead since, like 1842 or 1875. And so it can help give you kind of a timetable of when your ancestor arrived at that location. So, if you see, oh, they've been in that location since 1875, then you'll know prior to 1875, you may want to look in, another county or another state, as far as them migrating and moving to that particular location. And so, yeah, I just really enjoy this kind of thing. And I feel like, especially like these types of atlases, and maps that have these lists and charts and show land acreage and occupations and things like that, if you find the right county and time period, you may potentially find something like this for your own ancestor. And then that can help you fill in the gaps that you have in their information. And also, I'll reiterate this towards the end too, but finding things like this in the information, you can then double check like actual, like original records to make sure that things add up and it's the right person and they're in the right location and things like that. Okay, so then there are plat maps. So what are plat maps? Basically, kind of in general, they show who owns a piece of land. And I know a lot of times you can look at these when there's like early settlements of a town or a county. I know my home county, Spencer County, back in the day, I would go over to the courthouse and, I could look and find like plat books in our courthouse and then be like, okay, well, here are the people that, especially if I was working on like a history of Spencer County project or was researching for somebody, I could see, okay, well, there's like, I think Richard Taylor had bought land, and then basically that's kind of what helped create Taylorsville from what I remember. I could be off on some things, but and so you could see, okay, he had these plats, or this person had it's like you can kind of figure out who's where, especially if things are first settling and starting up and things like that. And then I did also get some definitions for some of these, because it's sometimes I don't want to accidentally say, oh, this map is what this does, and then I'm incorrect. So I wanted to get some official definitions for some of these maps that I don't necessarily look at super regularly. So according to this definition, a plat map provides the metes and bounds of a parcel and a land tract to scale, as well as the legal land use rights and limitations. Additionally, it demonstrates locations of streets and public utility easements, as well as ingress and egress easements. And sometimes plat maps provide information about landslide hazard zones, methane hazard zones, flood hazard zones, and more. So basically it gives you like the different tracts and then the legal information, along with showing like who's where and who owns those certain parcels of land. And so just kind of in general, it can also be another type of map that could help you figure out your ancestors' placement in the community. And so here are a couple of pictures I wanted to show. This is here in our collection at KHS, just in our main Martin F. Schmidt Research Library. This is, I believe, it was a Jefferson County plat map. And so like these are obviously, some of these maps, especially in our main library area, are going to be more like copies and things like that we've got in folders that patrons can come in and request to look at and pull out. We also have originals types of maps in our archives, but sometimes these types of maps are a little more convenient, especially if people are just trying to follow migration patterns of their ancestors, and this is a little quicker. So there's on the right side, the more far back picture, and this is still only part of the map just because it was such a big map, so I didn't actually unfold it all the way, but I just kind of wanted to give some imagery of it so you'd kind of have an idea of what it looks like or what it can look like. And then on the left side is the more close-up, and so you'll see like names and you'll see measurements and things like that. So yeah, so you'll see things like that, and a lot of times, like I mentioned earlier, like in courthouses, there'll be plat books potentially, so they'll be more bound in a book format. Okay, and then let's see, topographic maps. So what are those? Well, they are, let's see, the distinctive characteristic of a topographic map is the use of elevation contour lines to show the shape of the Earth's surface. Elevation contours, or imaginary lines connecting points having the same elevation on the surface of the land above or below a reference surface, which is usually mean sea level. Contours make it possible to show the height and shape of mountains, the depths of the ocean bottom, and the steepness of slopes. USGS, that is the U.S. Geological Survey, I believe. I was looking into this earlier. The topographic maps, they also show many other kinds of geographic features, including roads, railroads, rivers, streams, lakes, boundaries, place or feature names, mountains, and much more. Older maps published for 2006 show additional features such as trails, buildings, towns, mountain elevations, and survey control points. So basically these can, they can show you what man-made and nature-made landmarks are near your ancestor, and they may also tell you what type of land your ancestor lived on in general, like if they live more in mountainous regions or whatnot. And I mean, a lot of these types of maps, especially these, earlier maps, yeah, a lot of them are going to have landmarks of some sort, and like even ones that aren't topographic maps, you'll see, roads or rivers and things like that. Usually I've seen in other types of maps. So, these types of maps, including topographic maps, if you know your ancestor had land that was adjoining a particular body of water or some other property, some of these types of maps may be able to help you kind of pinpoint that. And then, like the previous map, here's a map, a topographic map of, I believe it was Crab Orchard, yeah. And so the right-hand side is just a more, so you can see more of the whole thing. And then I just kind of tried to do more close-up so you could get a little detail of, some of the names and that kind of thing, just so you can kind of have an idea of what you may see if you're looking at these types of maps. Okay, so before we jump into special interest maps, I do want to check for questions just in case. Okay. All right, not seeing anything as of yet. Okay, so we will continue on. So special interest maps, they are, I'm talking about these kind of in a twofold kind of way. So, I mean, first off, obviously, I do want to make people aware of some of these types of maps, just because you never know. You may come across a book of maps like I did, or you may go to an institution that has, very specific maps like this, and, just so you have an idea that they exist and they could help you with your research in some way. And then the other reason is, like I mentioned earlier, I thought some of these types of maps were interesting because I was, up until that point of seeing some of these, I just kind of assumed that there were basically just, maps that showed, locations, or maybe even had, homesteads, or showed people, their land that they owned, or, even topographic maps, just in general, I was, basically, familiar with that concept. So it was just interesting seeing these very specific, based off of data taken from, like census records or other types of documentation. And while these are very, very specific and they're technically for the whole United States, I'm sure, somewhere there's probably other types of maps like this for other years or other, and there's obviously other, what's the right word? Like, there was other special interest maps that are in this book that, I'm not going to necessarily talk about, but, so there's more than just these, but I just, thought it would be interesting to talk about and bring to your attention. And so these are going to be U.S. population density in 1820, average family size based on the 1900 census, regional industries in 1907, and then deaths from known causes in 1890. And so a lot of these are going to be more like, almost like color, like density scale maps. So you'll see, depending on the density or certain rates, certain parts of the country will be more darker or more lit up or colored in, I guess. So that's kind of more what these types of maps are. So there is a U.S. population density in 1820 map, and it shows the population density across the U.S. in 1820, and as I'll show you a picture in just a second, there's going to be a more dense population on the eastern end. And I mean, obviously this is still, fairly early in the U.S.'s history as far as being a country itself. And so there's still a lot of territories and not as much migration out west at this point. So, and once again, some of these pictures, it will be kind of hard to see like super detail just because I had to kind of, get everything fitted into the slides. Excuse me. But yeah, as you can see on that eastern end, there's a lot more darker coloring in, and then you go farther out towards the west and the Midwest, and it's, basically not colored in hardly at all, and there's some territories and things like that. So I just, seeing things like this, while, it may not be an immediate use to just general genealogy, family research, things like this could still tell you, like where an ancestor, if they were in this, more denser area of the country, or were they starting to filter out, into the Midwest and onwards. And so, and, even if you just have interest in, historic maps, it's just interesting seeing, the names change and, just things changing over the years and decades and things like that. So, I just find it interesting, but, you could also potentially find use in this, especially if, with the statistics and things like that. And so all of these special interest maps, basically the information I got about these maps comes from the book, the Family Tree Historical Maps book by Allison Dolan. And technically the pictures are from that as well, but they basically got the images of the different maps from the David Rumsey map collection. So that's where I got those from, basically, this section. And then there's average family size based on the 1900 census. It shows the average size of private families in the U.S. in 1900. And then there's going to be color gradients that demonstrate the size of families. The darker color equals more persons in the family or in the household. And then basically the absence of color is meaning that the population of that like square mile that they're basically calculating has less than 2 inhabitants. So there's basically nobody hardly. And so, yeah, that's the picture for that. And so, I mean, something like this could be interesting because this is also taking information from the 1900 census. So, you could kind of look at this and then look at the census and then kind of use them hand in hand, I guess. And I'm sure there's other maps like this relating to other censuses. And so, you can just kind of almost see a visualization, I guess, of the census in a map format, I guess is the best way I can put it. So, it could be interesting as well. And then there's regional industries in 1907 that showcases what the regional industries were in the U.S. in 1907. You could, potentially see what the major industries were in the area your ancestor may have lived in, and even maybe learn more about your ancestor's occupation this way, because, if they lived in an area that, chiefly worked in coal, not necessarily that your ancestor worked in the coal mines, but, there could be a chance if they lived in that predominant, where that was the main industry. And so, once again, you can just kind of look at maps like this and, get an idea of like, okay, this is what was the main industry in this area. And, I'm sure there's other years and things like that besides 1907. But it can give you an idea of, the community that your ancestor lived in, what was the main king of the industry in their area, and did they work in that particular industry or not. So it just kind of gives you a little more context, I guess, to your family history in a sense. And then this one's interesting too because it's deaths from known causes in 1890. And so there are, and this one might be a little harder that I'm going to show you to see just because this image is going to have multiple smaller maps depicting different causes of deaths that in 1890 basically. But you know, something like this could help you to see if there was a disease or illness that was prevalent in the area that your ancestor may have lived, and could help you understand the death of your ancestor better. I know sometimes I've had people come to me and they're looking for their ancestor and they just disappear all of a sudden. And, you know, it could be that they did die, you know, or they could have just moved somewhere, you know, where they're not in that particular area anymore. But, you know, sometimes I have looked for death records or causes of death, and there is also, I think I've seen it on Ancestry.com, and I think we've got a copy of it here at KHS, but I know there is, I believe, like I can't remember if it's an 1850 death schedule, like census, but I know there is like a specific document that's basically like a census record, but it'll, between like 1850 and like 1885 or something like that, it'll basically list individuals who died in that time frame and give like the cause of death and things like that. So I have looked at that before to be like, okay, this is why this person died just out of nowhere, you know, without any, you know, making any sense at all kind of thing. So, you know, looking at maps like this could, you know, potentially do the same thing or give you an idea to keep your eye out for, like, oh, if they lived, you know, if they lived in an area that was very, you know, prevalent with like scarlet fever or whooping cough or, you know, something like that, or measles, you know, there may be a chance then, you know, if they did mysteriously die, you know, around the time frame that things like this were really ramping up, you know, potentially they could have died from that. And then, you know, you might at least have a better idea of, you know, why they just mysteriously died and disappeared. And, you know, you could also, you know, then try to pinpoint, you know, a death record or anything that will show like the year and, you know, kind of pinpoint things that way. But yeah, like I said, yeah, this one's a little hard because they're even smaller than they have been, just because they fit multiple maps basically on these pages. But I thought things like this were interesting just because, you know, it's like, oh, okay, well, this was like, you know, like pneumonia was really bad in these certain areas, you know, in 1890 or around 1890. And so it's, you know, it's just kind of interesting, gives you a little more context and things like that as well, I would say. Okay, let me stop, check for questions again real quick just to make sure. Okay. All right, not seeing anything new. Okay, so how can maps help your research? Well, in general, they can help you follow an ancestor's migration, especially if you're looking at, you know, just kind of the typical maps that may show where somebody lived or who were homestead owners. And, you know, you can see, you know, basically, you know, especially if you can find maps that are, you know, like chronological, and to, you know, like if you're looking at like Henry County and you see a map for 1882 and you see your ancestor living there, and then you also then see them living there in 1880 in an 1883 map and maybe an 1884 map. And, you know, I'm not entirely sure how frequently some of these maps were made, unfortunately, but, you know, ideally, or even if it's like a 5-year gap, and you see them, you don't see them in that same location in a Henry County map 5 years later, well, then you might want to look at a surrounding county and look for a map for around that time, and then you may see them, and then you see, okay, well, they moved here, or the county changed lines, because that's the other thing also, is it can help you see if, you know, counties, you know, sprouted off into other counties and things like that around a certain time. And you can also learn about your ancestors' acreage. You can see, like, you know, some maps, or the ones like that have the homesteads, like the one I was pointing out earlier, the atlas, it'll tell you like what their acreage was. And so, you know, in other maps, you know, sometimes will show what their acreage was. You can also see who neighbors were. That's also another useful thing because, you know, these neighbors may be close friends or could be relatives of some sort. And if you are getting stuck locating an ancestor, you may want to jot down these names of these neighbors and then look for those neighbors in like a census record or some other kind of record that may tie them to the ancestor you're looking for. And, you know, you could also learn about your ancestor's occupation, like some of the other maps I've talked about. You know, you may see that a certain industry was very big in the area that your ancestor was living in, or in like the atlas for Henry County and Shelby County, there may be some kind of chart or something on the map that includes information about what their occupation was. And it just kind of helps you learn about who they were. A lot of these different types of maps, you know, you learn who they're living around, what they do, what they own, you know, if they're near any types of natural resources like rivers or mountains. And it can also, the information that these maps provide you can also supplement your findings that you find through other records. Like I've previously mentioned, you can take some of these different pieces of information and then compare it with other original records, or if you've already previously found information, you can, you know, put the information side by side and, you know, double check and make sure it fits and makes sense. Okay, so in general, where can you find maps? Well, like I previously mentioned, here at the Kentucky Historical Society, we've got several maps. We've got copies that are basically in folders in a drawer, in some drawers in our library collection. And then we've also got maps, you know, older original maps that we keep in our archives that, you know, people can come in and request to look at. There's other historical societies as well. Sometimes, you know, maybe even some local historical societies, like county historical societies, they may keep, you know, a historic map of their county, their respective county. I would also check with universities. That's a strong chance that they would probably have something of some sort. There's also just libraries in general, sometimes public libraries. Like I feel like my public library, I feel like we had some maps of like Spencer County, or at least, you know, a couple of historic maps. So sometimes checking a library or your local public library, especially if they, you know, here in Kentucky, a lot of public libraries have like a Kentucky genealogy area or a Kentucky room, and then they may keep some different genealogical materials relating to Kentucky or their respective counties, and that could include maps as well, possibly. And then other just historical institutions in general, you know, there could be, you know, historic sites or historic houses that, you know, will invite people to visit them and give them tours and educate them about the history of that place. And, you know, they may have maps relating to like their general area or whatnot. Okay, let's check one more time again for any questions. Okay. Okay, and so I know I got this a little out of order, but now I'm going to kind of go over a little bit of maps that you could find here at KHS. So basically several that we have discussed, as I've pointed out, like the map atlases that show the homesteads. We've got some topographic maps. We've got, you know, maps relating to early Kentucky, things like that. Ones that demonstrate or show, you know, like plats or show where people were living in different counties and sections of like the towns and things like that. And then I would say if you were going to visit us, and you wanted to just look at like just the copies that we have just in the main library, we do have a spreadsheet index on our library computers that the patrons come in and look at, and it will break down which shelf, which drawer has the different types of maps. And you're always more than welcome to ask our reference desk staff up at our reference desk, and then they can assist you that way as well. And then the original copies, like I previously mentioned, are in our archives, and for that you would basically, you could look in our catalog, and if it does pop up, you can basically give us the name of what it is, and if it's got a collection number or something, we would basically have you fill out this little call slip, and then you would hand it to one of our staff, and then they would go and retrieve it for you. I will also say that, hold on, I'll wait just a second on that. So here's an example of like a map of Scott County that's just in our regular collection. And so, you'll see a lot of maps like this. And then this one is a map showing the routes of Walker and I'm not sure if it's Gist or Gist, but basically it's their routes through Kentucky, or what would become Kentucky. So, it's another kind of early Kentucky maps that you may see if you're looking through our collection. And then this is it's this map of Kentucky that is from 1784, and it's just showing like the main, like what would become the original counties and things like that. And so this is one that's in our archives that you can come in and request to look at. However, it's also digitized, and that's what I was going to point out, but I wanted to wait until I got to this page. So a lot of our maps that are in archives have been digitized over the years, so you can always check our digital collection. And when you're in our main digital collection page, there's different material, like collection options you can pick to look at, like finding aids or manuscripts or images, and then there's one that's just for maps. And so it'll give you the different, let you look at the different maps that are digitized in our collection. And the beauty of that is you can actually look at any of our digitized items from the comfort of your own home on our website. So you wouldn't have to come here at all, if you wanted to just look at anything that's been digitized. Okay. And so in general, and this is just kind of things I like to tell people for genealogy in general. So important things to remember, check findings with other records, record your brick walls, mysteries, successes, and anything else you come upon in your family research journey, because your notes could help you navigate future research attempts or help you pass along useful information to a fellow researcher who may be struggling or is just starting out. And so that's always, good, useful things to remember. And then here's just basically my references for this presentation. Before I do the last final housekeeping bit, I'm going to check for questions. Okay, all right, so nothing so far. Okay, so basically I'm going to have 2 more presentations this year. There's going to be actually in the first Saturday of September, September 5th, is going to be Break Through the Brick Wall. This is basically, I think I've previously titled this presentation as kind of just answering your genealogy questions, because this is basically the program I like to do one or 2 times a year, just to be kind of an open door kind of experience where ideally, if you all have questions in general about genealogy, you can ask me, and I can try to the best of my ability, during the presentation to, answer those questions. other than that, I'll probably just be trying to give you just a presentation relating to, general useful genealogy, what to do if this happens kind of thing to help you get through brick walls. But, ideally, if you all have questions about, being stuck in a brick wall, you would present it, especially, at that presentation. And then, I didn't fix the date on this one. So the October one, I meant to change that. It's supposed to be October 3rd because I do need to, I had a schedule conflict for the 10th, so it will actually be October 3rd. That's going to be basically, the titles have been renamed, but this is Beyond the Grave. Basically, I'm going to talk about how to use like death records and like burial records and cemetery records for your family research and things like that. And I just kind of wanted to give it a, since it's October, Halloween, kind of give it a fun, like, spooky, ooh, kind of kind of thing going on, just so it's not just a very, straightforward, bland, this is how you do this kind of thing. But anyways, yeah, so that's going to be the final 2 programs for this year, September 5th and October 3rd. The next month when I'm updating the dates, I'll make sure to switch that number. And then also, as I've mentioned in other presentations, we have been restarting up our Kentucky Ancestors Online programming. And so this is basically on our web page. There's a dedicated page to where we will post articles relating to Kentucky history or genealogy in some form of way. And so basically we're asking for, any articles or proposals or interest from you all, anybody that, feels like, they want their story to be told relating to their Kentucky ancestors. And so in that note, articles or proposals should be submitted to the Kentucky Historical Society Reference Desk. If you do have questions about submitting an article or just in general interested in submitting an article and you'd like to ask about that or know more about that, you can email the reference desk. We do have new guidelines, so you may want to check in on that, and you can always email myself or our reference desk if you would like a copy of the guidelines. And so basically the reference desk email is there on the screen, so you can contact them. You can also contact me as well. And then here's my contact information. There's my email, and then that's my office phone number. So if you do have questions either about this presentation or genealogy in general or about the Kentucky Ancestors Online program, you can contact me as well, and I'll try to help you as best I can. I think that is going to be about it. I would say at this point, if you do have a burning question that you really need answered, it would probably be better if you just shoot me an email, and then I can get back to you and kind of digest what your mystery or your question is and better answer your question. But yeah, I thank you all for joining me today, and like I've mentioned at the start, my name is Daniel Ware, and I'm the Genealogy Librarian here at the Kentucky Historical Society. Thank you, and you all have a great day. Bye-bye.